Hello class, Mr. Ullman here. I wanted to fill you in this time on conservation biology, which is a new and important and growing field within biology. The purpose here for this particular podcast, why should we conserve and how can we conserve? So as we look at conservation, hopefully the question of why we should conserve is not something that you're really considering, because certainly it's been a part of the American education system for the last several decades to include at least the principle that we should try to use less, that we should try to get by with less resources, less waste. But certainly there's an emotional appeal. If nothing else, we know that Earth is a pretty special place, that it's not too likely for us to be able to get any further away to some other place, hypothetically, that might exist out there that has the same conditions that are just right for life to exist, at least as we know it. And so if we're stuck here, we have to make do with what we have. They aren't going to be making any more Earths anytime soon, so we better make sure that this one is going to last us for a while. Certainly, it's important for us to recognize that life is pretty amazing, that some of the most interesting things that we find here on Earth are the living creatures that live and breathe and die in this place, and so we want to be able to see those things continuing on into the future. And we have to recognize that most of the changes that have happened on Earth in the last several hundred years are as a result of things that we have done. So humans, more than any other factor in recorded history, have been having a pretty big impact on the rate of extinction and the number of particularly animal species that are gone or very nearly gone. So you look at a few species here with the Yangtze River dolphin, with the Javan rhinoceros, with the Philippine eagle. These are all animals that are tied together with something very sad in common, the fact that there's probably only a few, if any of them, left. There's some debate about each of them in terms of the exact number, but it's extremely small, and probably to the point that none of those three species, amongst dozens, hundreds, thousands of others, will survive for very long into the future. So we could take a look a little bit at why that is. There's certainly some good scientific reasons as well as to why it is that we should conserve, and mostly that has the fact to do with biodiversity, and the fact that biodiversity has such tremendous benefit for us in a lot of ways. We look at first of all genetic diversity. So the fact that all of the DNA that's present in all those species is of extreme value. So the DNA is able to provide variations that enable populations to be able to change and adapt to differing environmental conditions. Again, those things are present already in those species, so it's providing great knowledge, and that knowledge can be very useful for a lot of things in the future. With greater genetic diversity brings more species diversity, so more species are better able to survive. We use those species for food, we use them for resources, we use different parts of animals to make a lot of different products, and very important, medicine. A lot of our medicines that we use on a very regular basis are chemicals that were derived from plants. So we find the plants, and then we find medicine that allows us to treat some of our illnesses and ailments. And then perhaps most importantly is that once we get these viable, we get the species diversity, that's going to create more viable ecosystems. And ecosystems provide a lot of services for us. They recycle nutrients, so providing our soils, for example, with phosphorus and nitrogen. Being able to purify wastes, that's the great benefit of places like swamps and wetlands. Will filter out a lot of our wastewater and ensure that the water is going to be cleaned so that we can have fresh, clean drinking water. And looking at things as simple as being able to provide resources like oxygen. Without the ecosystems and those plants being able to produce that oxygen, we wouldn't have what we need to be able to breathe. So, as we look ahead, we've covered population, how human population is growing. You see, here's another image here looking at life expectancy from the early part of the 1900s to today has continued to rise. Infant mortality has continued to drop, and based on just simple population study, that shows that our population is not sustainable, that we can't continue to grow at the rate that we've grown over the last 200 years and expect the Earth to look like what it does now, and certainly won't look like what it did a few hundred years ago. We certainly have to recognize that humans, more than anything else, have impacted our environment. This is the idea of conservation isn't one that's new, because certainly people for millennia, as long as there have been people around, have known that we need to act in a certain way in order to be able to maintain the resources that the Earth has, to protect those things for future generations. However, technology and the Industrial Revolution really changed the ways in which we interacted with our environment, and so we needed to have a rise of a new group of scientists and a new group of people who were made aware of some of those impacts that humans were having, because I think in many cases we were blind to it. This woman here, Rachel Carson, is particularly important because her book, Silent Spring, was one that is looked back on as really what started what we know today as the environmentalist movement, and raising awareness of how it is that people have been changing the environment, and we need to understand what those changes are and how we can work against those things. When we look at climate, that's a topic that we'll spend some time on. We know that the climate has been shifting and will continue to shift. We see that, that we will look at some projections about how it is that warming will happen and what impact that has on species as we continue to warm the environment. We'll see ranges of particular species changing, and we will very likely see populations decline as a result of that change. This brings up two fundamental perspectives on that truth. Okay, if we know that humans are impacting the environment, well, we can choose, first of all, to conserve. And conservation is the study of how humans interact with our ecosystems and how it is that humans can minimize that impact so that we cause as little harm, as little damage, and make sure we preserve as much as possible for the future. It is, though, a more passive point of view, whereas environmentalism is more of a philosophy of one the thinking that humans, because we have caused this destruction to the ecosystem in the past few hundred years, that it's our responsibility there to ensure that the environment is going to be protected, in some cases at all costs, so that it will be able to persevere into the future. Now, that brings us then to how. How can we conserve? Well, we need to recognize some of those impacts. How is it that our behavior and our actions, how do those have sometimes unforeseen impacts on the environment? So, probably for many years, people, enjoyed having, piano keys made of ivory, enjoyed, having being able to use that material as something because it was durable, it was beautiful, without really recognizing that when they were buying those items, that they were causing the death and near extinction of elephants from which they came from. When we eat our hamburgers, do we understand the impact that the amount of meat that we eat that has in terms of the amount of land, the amount of water, the amount of fertilizer, all of those things that go into producing that food, again, has an environmental cost on the land. Now, as we reduce the amount of land that's available for these natural ecosystems, we're making smaller and smaller the population sizes. And once you get small populations, you start what's called the extinction vortex. Small population will lead to more inbreeding and more mutations. That leads to a loss of genetic variability, so that if there is things like an environmental shift, where the climate is changing, or there's some type of stress put on that population, the organisms reproduce less, they die more often, they have a smaller population, and then that cycle continues over and over and over, down, down, and down, until the point at which extinctions begin to occur. When we look at a couple of examples here, this first one shows a population of greater prairie chickens. So this is this is a wild bird that lived here in Illinois. If we notice the number of male birds, as that decreased over time, that the population was continuing to go down and down and down, because there were simply not enough birds with not enough genetic variability in order to be able to sustain the population. So they stopped reproducing. There stopped being baby chicks. And then there was a translocation that occurred. Where scientists intervened by taking some male birds and moving them from one population to the next. And as a result of that movement, there was a greater variety. The birds were no longer having to inbreed, and so they reproduced more, and so the population increased. And we saw this big increase in the number of eggs that successfully hatched because those populations were aided. So this is an example of where, had humans not really stepped in, it was likely that this was a bird that or at least these populations, were going to be wiped out. This is an artificial example. So this is an experiment that was conducted on forest in New Hampshire, and studies were done to see what would happen to this protected area if all the trees were cut down, if it was completely deforested. And so they had a control plot, and they looked to see what was the nitrogen concentration in runoff. And when the forest was there, the amount of nitrogen in the runoff remained pretty low. When the forests were cut down, the amount of nitrogen then in the soil, the runoff, when it rained, all that rainwater was carrying the nitrogen away. And nitrogen is often the limiting factor preventing the further growth of plants. So if there's no forest, like if humans come in and cut down all of the trees, then every time it rains, all the nutrients are being leached out of the soil, so that then very little or nothing will be able to grow in the future once that forest is completely gone. So again, it's ruining the land not just temporarily, but it's ruining it forever. Here, when we look at what humans are doing in terms of carving up the land as we're doing things like farming, the difference here is what does an ecosystem look like on the edge of a habitat versus in the center. And the center of a habitat is going to be the most protected. It's going to offer the greatest variety of plants, and so it's going to have then the greatest variety of animals because there'll be more food, more shelter, more protection for them. The conditions at the edges are usually more fragile. There's usually less variety of plants, and certainly very many fewer animals that will live on the edge of a habitat. So when humans come in and we log, or we build roads, or we do things that cause these divisions between these pockets of land, it decreases the diversity of those areas. So two small forests are not going to be the same as one big forest as a result. Now, how is it that we can conserve? So what are things that we can do? Well, we can monitor, so simply making counts, doing population surveys and seeing what species are going to be threatened, what ecosystems are threatened, doing counts of diversity to be able to evaluate the health of ecosystems and particularly parks and those natural areas that still exist. We can look at, we can plan, so we can take information from monitoring and numbers of species, and we can plan and see where are places where it's likely that extinctions are going to occur, where are places where we're going to see collapses in population. And as you can see, the triangles represent marine biodiversity hotspots, and the shaded area represent terrestrial, so on land biodiversity hotspots. So those places are where there is a lot of diversity still present on the land or in that water. There's still a wide variety of species, but those are areas that are threatened, and so they are at risk of collapse. And so those are areas where we could then concentrate our effort, making more laws, preventing logging, preventing hunting, create more reserves that are going to set that land aside for it to be protected into the future. We can plan things like being able to connect together habitats. So if we're going to build a highway that's going through a protected area or through a park, will there be a way for animals on one side of that habitat to get to the other side of the habitat without having to cross the road, because ultimately that road will act as a barrier that isolates one population from the next, and isolated populations will then spiral down that extinction vortex. So good planning will help to prevent against that. We need to understand what's the range that's necessary. So, if we are building parks, are our parks large enough to be able to accommodate the animals that we want to protect? So, if we have a grizzly bear, do we have enough land protected for that grizzly bear to have enough food and a wide enough space for it to be able to be successful in not just surviving, but then being able to reproduce and increase its population size into the future? Other actions that we can take. We can monitor to determine when it is that we need to conserve a particular species or ecosystem. We have 58 national parks across the country. Those parks we don't have to stop where we're at. We can create new parks, new national parks from land that's already owned by the government to be able to protect more areas. When we see that there are certain species that are threatened, when we see an area that we'll be able to that has something vital, something helpful, something that at least has potential in terms of its value to us and to generations to come, if we create those parks now, we can ensure that it's more likely that those things will survive into the future. Now, if you compare the amount of green here for the United States, and then we compare that to the amount of green here in Costa Rica, you can see what the greater percentage is of the amount of land in Costa Rica available or set aside as parkland. And not only do they have this parkland, they've also established buffer zones. So the buffer zones whereas there are very strict restrictions within the national park itself, the buffer zones have also been set up to place more limits on the impact of humans in terms of how much they can build and pollution and some of those negative impacts, because we have to understand that just because we set up a park doesn't mean that the animals and plants that we're trying to protect are going to stay within that park. So if the animals are going to move both into and out of that park, if we offer them some protection outside the park as well, it's more likely that they will not succumb to hunters and poachers and some of those things that might cause them to die out. Overall, there's thousands of national parks across the world, and it's one of the efforts of a lot of conservationists is to provide funding and research and expertise to other countries to encourage them to be able to set up more parks. And then another field is restoration ecology, and this is understanding what are those areas that we've already damaged or destroyed, and how can we work to be able to restore those to what they should look like. Another local example here from Tennessee. This is looking at the uranium salt pools. So this is an area where nuclear power was first developed, and testing on the nuclear bombs happened back in the 1940s. And you can see here the color here. I mean, obviously you can tell that this is not very nice stuff. But the uranium that's present in these pools is something that lasts a long time. It's poisonous, it's cancer causing, and so it's not something that really living things can interact with. However, there are bacteria that will be able to digest and decompose that uranium, and the addition of ethanol to the pools increased the activity of those bacteria, and then, as you can see from the dots, decreased the amount of uranium that was available there. So being able to use scientific research to be able to figure out how can we best restore those areas so that they can look like what we would like them to look like. Here you can see in New Jersey, this is a mine, and you can see the before and after, how with a little bit of effort we can put in place a plan that will ensure the restoration and then the eventual success of an ecosystem. So once humans have used that land for whatever reason we might have used it for, there certainly is always potential for us to restore it back to what it looked like prior to humans using it. So this is a field that there's certainly no shortage of work, because there are lots of areas in which, from every country, every corner of the world, some ways in which humans have had some type of negative impact on the world's ecosystems. And if we want to ensure that those things are going to continue into the future, we need more people to be able to do that work, to figure out what conservation and what restoration is going to look like.